What's the problem? In employment, because innovation will have to happen at the intersection of employment and employability. It'll have to become a job with fine print. But today the employment elasticity is increasing because there's a labor-saving bias. We encourage the substitution of labor by capital. One is productivity-driven, but just one is another which is amplified by the labor laws. So we have a missing middle in our labor market. You're either hero or zero. So low-skill organized manufacturing hasn't developed for many reasons, but one of them has to be labor laws. The unorganized sector is 93%. It's very hard to train for the unorganized sector. It is very hard to create the corridor effect of organized sector employment doesn't exist. 50% of India is self-employed. The poor cannot afford to be unemployed, so they are self-employed. I'm not no contempt for self-employment. When I started this company 5 years ago, I thought we would have nothing to do with self-employment. But 35% of the people who approach us, of the 100,000 every month, are self-employed marginally and looking for, just give me 4,000 rupees or 3,000 and I'm happy, because not everybody can be an entrepreneur. Employment exchanges are defunct. Candidate aggregation, most training companies spend 30-35% of their revenues on candidate acquisition. And there are 1,400 employment exchanges in this country who gave 200,000 jobs to the 40 million people registered. So obviously they're not doing a good job. Benefits are linked to employer rather than employees. Sometimes in the organized sector that can impact labor mobility. And I think the unions, trade unions, it's minority rule. Job preservation is not a form of job creation. I think we have let 7% of the labor force, which is what unions are, present their self-interests, national interests. So there is a contradiction between the needs of unorganized labor and organized labor, which I don't think is completely surfaced or recognized in policy yet. So all of these are very related and urgent to the skill development issue, because, agricultural productivity, at least in my mind, there's no question agriculture is not going to solve any of our problems. We became the largest producer of milk in the world last year. We produced 100 million tons of milk. There were 75 million people involved in that process. The US produces 60 million tons of milk with 100,000 people. These 75 million people are not employed. They're hanging out. You're condemning them to poverty unless you get them out. In the next 10 years, 1 out of 4, so 25% of the world's workers will be in Indian labor market outsiders, which are my primary constituency, less skilled, less educated, people from small towns, women, just don't have the access because our labor laws are written for middle-aged men in manufacturing with a wife sitting at home, and there's a lot more diversity in the labor market right now. In the short run, we can't take jobs to people. We have to take people for jobs. We can't take training to people, because if you take people to training, you double the cost of training. But I think that's an important element which hasn't been recognized yet in policy. I think the geography of work, we have 600,000 villages with less than 200 people. So the geography of work, the nature of the fact that work tends to cluster. We only have 34 cities with more than 1 million people. China probably has 160. I'm just purely talking about, because our interest is where our jobs being created, and the geography of work is so lopsided that really amplifies the ovarian lottery in a sense. We can't afford social security. People who talk about social security in India haven't done the math. If we were to pay half our per capita GDP to 26% of our population who lives under poverty, that would need 14% of GDP and would wipe out tax receipts. So the only social security we can afford are job creation and skill development. And obviously equality of opportunity. So there are 4 questions which all of us have to answer. I don't have answers to all these questions, and I don't mean it to be us versus government versus civil society. But these questions haven't changed. There's an old story about Professor Einstein. He gave an exam to his students, and 15 minutes into the exam, a kid got up and said, "Professor Einstein, the questions in this year's exam are exactly the same as last year's exam." He said, "Yes, but the answers are different this year." And I think that's true for what we're going through in human capital. I personally have concluded that there is no way to get a return on investment for an employer to manufacture your own employees. There are 3 holes in the bucket. You train them and they don't qualify. You train them, they qualify but they're not productive. You train them, they qualify, they're productive, and they leave. So by the time you're done with 3 holes in the bucket, most employers have realized that anything other than last mile unemployability of 1 month, 2 month, 3 month training, it's not possible to get a return on your investment. So you can do some CSR, but we were hoping that the privatization of skill development by employers would become an engine which would add to everything else that's going on. there is a free rider problem, so you can focus on manufacturing your employees, but everybody in the industry benefits, and that's often a challenge. And is manufacturing employees a core or a non-core activity? You know, all employers in India or any entrepreneur in India is already substituting for the state in many ways. We generate our own power, we provide our own transport, we generate our own water. Can we manufacture our own employees? And even if we choose to, for existential reasons, how can we justify that non-core activity when we're making steel and we're manufacturing our own employees? So I think these are important questions which employers are struggling with. Private trainers, you know, can you be agreed to be paid for yield? You know, I have this argument with trainers all the time saying, why should I pay you for everybody you train? I'll pay you for all the people I hire. And then they run away. You know, they say, oh, you can't put lipstick on a pig and you don't understand the business. But I think that if we want to scale, then we've got to figure out how to have some connection to yield rather than output. And can we unpack the financing from the delivery? Because those are two different thought worlds. They're very closely related thought worlds, but financing and delivery, what is your focus, is what private trainers need to answer. With civil society and NGOs, I think this self-employment is a very important part of the solution, but it's not the only solution. I think there are limitations to the solution given the other constraints that we have in India around infrastructure, credit, and just people's ability to be entrepreneurs. I think the other one which I struggle with, and I've run 50 pilots with NGOs of various kinds saying, you know, we'll produce employees to your specs, is just the whole inch wide, mile deep versus mile wide, inch deep. If you're trying to solve 5-6 problems at the same time, and skills is only one of them. And I'm intuitively understanding why they want to do health and education and everything. But it just seems like a very difficult game when I am focused on a very narrow problem. And I don't think there's one model. We had the argument before we came here, but as an entrepreneur, there are two kinds of companies you can create, a baby and a dwarf. And a baby and a dwarf are both small, but the baby is going to grow and the dwarf is going to stay there. The difference between a baby and a dwarf is not more food, it's not more money. Most people will say, if I had more money, I would scale. The difference in a baby and a dwarf is in DNA. It's in templatization, componentization, standardization. Standardization is not the enemy of localization. Standardization is not the enemy. There's not one solution which fits all. But if you want to scale, and I come from a very narrow perspective, there are a mere million flowers bloom, but you know, this problem of 5-10 million people every year is going to require some scale interventions. And so we've got to think about that, of how the different stakeholders can work together to move the needle truly on a larger scale than we're doing today. State versus center in public policy is an important one which we haven't resolved yet. The delivery systems, ITIs, Rudy cities, employment exchanges, schools are all in the hands of the states, while all the money and most of the curriculum, funnily, is in the hands of the center. The 19 ministries which are involved in skill development, there are only 2 human capital ministries. There's a clear tension there. And just moving from outlays to outcomes. You know, you don't repair leaky pipes by turning up the water pressure. So how do you move from spending money, which is not an easy thing to do, but I think we figured out where the resources are for doing it, but you know, we're not really seeing the outcomes even though we've substantially increased the spending.